The hawk fell from the cloudless Wyoming sky like a broken promise, spinning down through the autumn air with one wing trailing uselessly behind. And Katherine Ellis knew the moment she saw it that she had to try to save it or carry the weight of not trying for the rest of her life. She had been gathering wild sage near her family's homestead outside Independence Rock, that massive granite landmark that had guided countless travelers along the Oregon Trail for decades. The year was 1881, and though the great wagon migrations had slowed to a trickle, the land still held the echoes of all those desperate dreams. Katherine was 22 years old, unmarried by choice rather than circumstance, with hair the color of creek-washed copper and hands that knew how to coax life back into wounded things. The hawk hit the ground 30 yards from where she stood, a crumpled mass of brown feathers and fury. Most people would have left it alone. Hawks were wild creatures, dangerous when cornered, and this one was a red-tailed beauty, probably female given the size, with talons that could tear through leather. But Katherine had been nursing injured animals since she was old enough to understand that suffering deserved attention, whether it came wrapped in fur, feathers, or human skin. She approached slowly, speaking in low tones that carried more feeling than words. The hawk's yellow eyes tracked her movement, bright with pain and defiance. One wing was clearly broken, bent at an angle that made Katherine's stomach clench. She pulled off her work shirt, leaving just her cotton camisole beneath, and used the heavier fabric to carefully wrap the bird before it could strike. Even through the cloth, she could feel the rapid hammering of its heart. The walk back to the homestead took 20 minutes, and with each step, Katherine planned her approach. Her father had died 2 years ago, kicked in the head by a spooked horse, leaving Katherine and her mother alone on their 200 acres. Her mother, Evangeline, had the same gift with wounded creatures, though she focused her talents on people, serving as the closest thing to a doctor that their scattered community had. The house was a sturdy log structure with a stone chimney, built by her father's hands during better years. Katherine headed straight for the barn, a weathered building that leaned slightly to the east, but had good bones underneath the aging wood. She had converted one of the empty stalls into a recovery space for injured animals over the years, much to her mother's amused tolerance. She fashioned a cage from an old crate, then carefully unwrapped the hawk. The bird immediately tried to strike, but Katherine was ready, her movements practiced and sure. She examined the wing with gentle fingers, feeling along the bone until she found the break. Clean, thankfully, not shattered. It could heal if given time and proper setting. Working with materials her mother used for human patients, Katherine created a splint from thin strips of wood and cloth bandaging. The hawk fought her throughout, its beak drawing blood from her hand twice, but Katherine persisted with the kind of stubborn determination that had defined her entire life. When she finally finished, the wing was immobilized, held in a position that would allow the bone to knit properly. "You will fly again," Katherine whispered to the exhausted bird. "I promise you that." She was cleaning the blood from her hands at the water pump outside the barn when she heard the horse approaching. Katherine looked up to see a rider coming down the long dirt path that connected their homestead to the main trail, his silhouette dark against the late afternoon sun. Something about the way he sat in the saddle, shoulders slightly hunched, head bowed, spoke of a weariness that went deeper than physical exhaustion. As he drew closer, Katherine could make out more details. He was tall, lean in the way of men who worked hard and ate irregularly, probably in his mid-20s. He wore the practical clothing of a working cowboy, denim trousers dusty from travel, a faded blue shirt, a vest that had seen better years, and a hat with a curved brim that shaded his face. His horse was a buckskin gelding, well cared for despite the dust coating its hide. The rider stopped a respectful distance from where Katherine stood, as if approaching closer might be presumptuous. When he finally lifted his head, she saw a face that was more interesting than handsome, weathered by sun and wind, with dark eyes that held something haunted in their depths. A faint scar ran along his jawline, white against his tanned skin. "Madam," he said, his voice rough as creek gravel, "I am looking for Mrs. Ellis. I was told in town she might help with a medical situation." "My mother is visiting the Swenson family today," Katherine replied, wiping her hands on her trousers. "Their youngest has the croup. She will not return until tomorrow morning at the earliest." "I am Katherine Ellis. Perhaps I can help." The rider dismounted with a fluid grace that spoke of years in the saddle. Up close, Katherine could see the shadows under his eyes, the tightness around his mouth that suggested pain being held at bay through sheer will. "I am Preston Aldridge," he said, removing his hat to reveal dark hair that needed cutting. "I work at the Three Rivers Ranch about 15 miles northeast of here. I was not looking for medical help for myself, not in the way you might think." Katherine waited, studying him. There was something decent in his face, something fundamentally good beneath the obvious exhaustion and that haunted quality in his eyes. Preston seemed to struggle with his words, looking down at his hat, turning it in his hands. "I saw you walk into the barn earlier, carrying something wrapped in your shirt. I have been sitting out by your property line for the better part of an hour, trying to decide whether to approach. Then I saw you come out and noticed the blood on your hands, and I thought perhaps you were someone who understood about healing. You rode 15 miles because you saw me carry something into the barn." Katherine kept her tone neutral, though her curiosity was thoroughly sparked. "No, madam. I rode 15 miles because I was told Mrs. Ellis was a healer, but I stayed because I saw you handling that wounded bird with a gentleness I have not witnessed in a long time." Preston met her eyes directly. "I have been told I am a competent ranch hand. I can handle cattle, break horses, mend fences, track strays through rough country, and outwork most men twice my size. But I cannot seem to heal the thing inside me that is broken, and it is starting to affect everything else in my life." The raw honesty in his voice caught Katherine off guard. People in their world, especially men, did not speak of inner wounds so directly. They buried pain under hard work and harder drinking, under long silences and careful distances. "You want me to heal your heart," Katherine said softly. "I know how that sounds," Preston replied. "I know I have no right to approach a stranger with something like this. But I have tried everything else, and I am running out of options. The foreman at Three Rivers told me this morning that if I cannot get myself together, he will have to let me go. I cannot afford to lose this position. More than that, I cannot afford to keep living like this, carrying around this weight that gets heavier every day." Katherine was quiet for a long moment, considering. The smart thing would be to send him away, to tell him to wait for her mother's return. But something in his face, in the desperate hope warring with resignation in his eyes, pulled at something deep inside her. "Come into the barn," she said finally. "I want to show you something." Preston followed her into the dim interior of the barn, which smelled of hay and horses and old wood. Katherine led him to the stall where she had placed the hawk's cage. The bird was huddled in the corner, its broken wing held awkwardly against its body by the splint. "I found her less than 2 hours ago," Katherine said. "Fell from the sky with a broken wing. By all logic, I should have left her where she landed. Hawks are dangerous, unpredictable, and difficult to help even when they are not injured. This one fought me every step of the way while I set her wing. Drew blood twice." She held up her bandaged hand as evidence. Preston looked at the hawk, then at Katherine, waiting for her to continue. "But I brought her home anyway because leaving her to die was not something I could do," Katherine said. "Sometimes we help others not because it is easy or logical, but because we cannot live with ourselves if we do not try. You rode 15 miles on the hope that someone might understand what you are carrying. That took courage. The least I can do is listen." They sat on hay bales in the barn while the afternoon light slanted through gaps in the walls, painting golden stripes across the dirt floor. Preston's story came out slowly at first, then faster, like water finally released from a dam. He had grown up in Nebraska, the youngest of 4 children. His childhood had been ordinary enough, marked by the usual struggles of farm life but warmed by the presence of a close-knit family. When he was 19, he had fallen in love with a girl named Sarah, the daughter of a neighboring farmer. They had planned to marry, had dreamed about starting their own small ranch, raising children and cattle and building a life together. 2 months before the wedding, Sarah had died of scarlet fever. It had come on suddenly, taking her from healthy to gone in less than a week. Preston had been holding her hand when she took her last breath, watching helplessly as the disease burned through her despite everything the doctor tried. "That was 4 years ago," Preston said, his voice flat with the effort of keeping emotion contained. "4 years, and I still wake up some mornings forgetting she is gone. I still find myself thinking about things I want to tell her, places I want to show her. My family told me I needed to move on, that time would heal the wound, but it has not. If anything, it has gotten worse. The grief has settled into something darker, something that makes everything feel empty and pointless." Katherine listened without interrupting, her heart aching for the raw pain in his words. She understood loss, had felt it when her father died, but she recognized that Preston's wound went deeper, complicated by the particular cruelty of losing a future before it could even begin. "I left Nebraska about a year ago," Preston continued. "Thought maybe a change of scenery would help. I have been drifting from ranch to ranch, never staying anywhere too long because I cannot seem to care enough about anything to put down roots. The work at 3 Rivers is good, the foreman is fair, but I can feel myself sliding into the same pattern, going through motions without being present. Making careless mistakes because part of me is always somewhere else." "What made you finally seek help?" Katherine asked gently. Preston was quiet for a moment, his jaw working. "Last week, I was working with a young horse, breaking him to saddle. I was distracted, not paying proper attention, and he spooked. Threw me hard enough to crack 2 ribs. Could have been worse, could have been my neck. The foreman said I was lucky, but the thing is, when I was lying there in the dirt trying to catch my breath, my first thought was not relief that I survived. It was disappointment that I had not been hurt worse. That scared me more than the fall did." Katherine felt a chill run through her despite the warmth of the barn. She recognized what he was describing, that dangerous place where pain became so overwhelming that oblivion started looking appealing. "I do not have easy answers," she said carefully. "I am not a doctor, not trained in anything except what my mother has taught me about setting bones and treating fevers. What you are describing is a wound I cannot stitch or splint." "I know," Preston said, "but maybe you could teach me whatever it is you know about healing. About coaxing broken things back to wholeness." Katherine looked at the hawk, which had been watching them with those fierce yellow eyes throughout the entire conversation. The bird was still wild, still dangerous, but the fight had gone out of her for the moment, replaced by a wary sort of assessment, as if she was trying to decide whether these humans represented another threat or possibly, improbably, some form of help. "Healing takes time," Katherine said. "It takes patience, consistency, and the willingness to endure setbacks. That hawk will try to remove her splint. She will refuse food out of stress. She might die despite everything I do for her because sometimes injuries are too severe, or the will to survive is not strong enough. But I will show up every day and try because the trying itself matters, even if the outcome is uncertain. Will you show up for me the same way? Preston asked, and there was something vulnerable in his expression that made Catherine's decision before she consciously chose. Yes, she said simply. But you have to promise me something in return. You have to promise that you will actually try, that you will show up not just physically but actually be present in the work. Healing is not something I can do to you. It is something we have to work toward together. Preston nodded, and for the first time since he had arrived, something like hope flickered in his eyes. I promise. What do we do first? Katherine stood, brushing hay from her trousers. First, you help me feed the hawk. She needs to eat, but she is too stressed and angry to make it easy. We will have to be patient and persistent, a bit like healing grief, actually. The thing that sustains you often feels impossible to accept when you are in the deepest part of the pain. They spent the next hour working with the hawk. Katherine had cut up strips of fresh meat, leftovers from the rabbit she had caught the day before. The hawk refused to eat at first, hunching in the corner of her cage, radiating hostility. Katherine showed Preston how to be still, how to be present without being threatening, how to offer sustenance without demanding it be accepted. Finally, after nearly 45 minutes of patient waiting, the hawk darted forward and snatched a piece of meat from Katherine's fingers. It was a small victory, but Katherine felt the same quiet satisfaction she always experienced when a wounded creature chose survival over surrender. Tomorrow, we will try to get her to eat more, Katherine said as they left the barn. It will get easier each day as she learns to trust that we are not going to hurt her. Preston was quiet as he prepared to mount his horse. The sun was sinking toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed too beautiful for the difficult conversations they had shared. Thank you, he said finally, for listening, for not treating me like I am broken beyond repair. Everyone is a little broken, Katherine replied. The question is whether we choose to let the broken places define us or whether we do the hard work of healing. Come back tomorrow evening after your work at the ranch is done. We will work with the hawk and we will talk. That is where healing starts, with showing up and doing the next small thing. Preston nodded, something settling in his expression that looked almost like peace. He rode away as the light faded, and Katherine stood watching until he disappeared down the trail, wondering what exactly she had agreed to, and why the prospect of seeing him again tomorrow made her heart beat a little faster. Her mother returned the next afternoon, tired from a long night helping the Swenson child through the worst of the croup. Evangeline Ellis was 52, with silver threading through her dark hair and the kind of steady competence that made people trust her instinctively. She listened without comment as Katherine explained about Preston's visit, though her eyes sharpened with interest. You told him to come back? Evangeline asked, kneading dough for bread at the kitchen table. I did, Katherine said, feeling slightly defensive though her mother's tone held no judgment. Good, Evangeline said simply. A person who has the courage to ask for help deserves to receive it. Just be careful, daughter. Healing wounds of the heart is more complicated than setting bones. You can get tangled up in another person's pain if you are not careful about boundaries. I know, Katherine said, though she was not entirely certain she did. Preston arrived as promised just as the sun was beginning its descent. Katherine was already in the barn, checking on the hawk, who had eaten a little more that morning, a promising sign. She heard Preston's horse outside, the creak of leather as he dismounted, his footsteps approaching the barn door. How is she? he asked, moving to stand beside Katherine at the cage. Stronger, Katherine said. Look at her eyes. More alert today, more present. Yesterday she was in shock, just trying to survive the immediate trauma. Today she is starting to assess her situation, to think about what comes next. They worked together in comfortable silence, Katherine showing Preston how to handle the hawk for her daily examination, how to check that the splint was secure without causing unnecessary stress. Preston's hands were surprisingly gentle for someone so large, his movements careful and considered. After they finished with the hawk, they walked down to the creek that ran along the southern edge of the Ellis property. The evening was cool, the first real hint of autumn in the air, and the water burbled over smooth stones with a sound that had always calmed Katherine's spirit. They sat on the creek bank, and Katherine asked Preston to tell her about Sarah, not about her death but about her life. At first he struggled, his face tight with the effort of remembering without drowning in grief. But Katherine persisted with gentle questions, and slowly the memories came. Sarah had loved thunderstorms, Preston said. She would stand on the porch of her father's house watching lightning split the sky, completely unafraid, her face tipped up to catch the rain. She had a terrible singing voice but sang anyway, making up ridiculous lyrics to popular songs until Preston laughed despite himself. She collected smooth stones from the creek, filling her pockets with them until her mother complained about the wear on her clothing. She wanted 6 children, a number Preston had found terrifying until she convinced him they could manage it together. As Preston talked, his voice lost some of its flatness, taking on color and warmth. Katherine watched his face transform, saw how memory could be painful but also precious, a way of keeping love alive even after death had tried to end it. She sounds remarkable, Katherine said softly when Preston finally fell silent. She was, Preston agreed. But sometimes I wonder if I have built her up too much in my memory, made her more perfect than any real person could be. It feels disloyal to admit that we probably would have fought sometimes, that marriage would have been hard work along with the joy. But maybe holding on to an idealized version of her is part of what is keeping me stuck. It was an insightful observation, one that suggested Preston was more self-aware than his earlier despair had indicated. Katherine felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could find his way through this grief to something like wholeness on the other side. They met every evening for the next week, falling into a rhythm that felt natural despite its strangeness. Preston would arrive after finishing his work at 3 Rivers, tired and dusty, but he always came. They would work with the hawk first, and each day she grew a little stronger, a little more willing to accept their presence. Then they would walk to the creek or sit in the barn and they would talk. Katherine told Preston about her father's death, about the complicated grief that came with losing someone to a sudden accident. How she had struggled with anger along with the sadness, angry at the horse that kicked him, angry at her father for not being more careful, angry at God for letting it happen at all. How she had eventually learned that grief rarely came in neat, manageable packages, but was instead messy and contradictory, and sometimes overwhelming. Preston listened with the same careful attention Katherine gave him, and she realized that he was healing her a little too, giving her someone who understood that wounds left scars even after they closed. On the 8th day, something shifted. The hawk allowed Katherine to remove the splint for examination without fighting, standing calm and watchful as Katherine felt along the bone. The break had knitted well, the wing regaining its natural shape. It was too soon to let the bird try to fly, but the progress was undeniable. "She trusts you," Preston said, watching from a careful distance. "She has learned that we are not going to hurt her," Katherine corrected. Trust is a process built up through consistent action over time. You cannot force it or rush it. You can only keep showing up and proving yourself trustworthy until the wounded thing decides to believe you. She was talking about the hawk, but they both knew the lesson applied more broadly. Preston's grief was loosening its grip day by day, not disappearing but becoming something more manageable, less suffocating. He smiled more easily now, and the shadows under his eyes had lightened. He talked about work at 3 Rivers with genuine engagement, mentioning plans to help build a new barn in the spring, speaking about future as if he expected to be around to see it. Katherine found herself looking forward to his visits with an intensity that had nothing to do with healing, and everything to do with the way her heart lifted when she saw him riding down the trail. She noticed small things about him: the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the deep timbre of his laugh, the gentle competence of his hands whether he was working with the hawk or helping her repair a loose board on the barn door. It was her mother who finally said what Katherine had been trying not to acknowledge. They were sitting on the porch one evening after Preston had left, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. "You are falling in love with him," Evangeline said, her tone matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. Katherine wanted to deny it, but she had never been good at lying, especially to her mother. "I think I might be," she admitted quietly. "Is that terrible, taking advantage of someone vulnerable? Is he falling in love with you as well?" Evangeline asked. Katherine thought about the way Preston looked at her lately, a warmth in his gaze that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with genuine affection. How his hand would linger when he helped her over rough ground on their walks. The way he found excuses to stay a little longer each evening, reluctant to leave her company. "Maybe," Katherine said. "Then it is not taking advantage," Evangeline replied. "It is 2 people finding each other at the right time. Sometimes healing and loving are intertwined. Just make sure you are both clear about what you are building together." 2 weeks after Preston's first visit, Katherine decided the hawk was ready to test her wing. The splint had been off for 3 days, and the bird was moving around her cage with increasing agitation, no longer content with confinement. It was a cool Saturday afternoon, and Preston had arranged to have the day off from the ranch so he could be present for this critical moment. They carried the cage out to an open area behind the barn, a flat stretch of ground that gave way to open prairie beyond. Katherine had butterflies in her stomach, nervous about what they might discover. If the wing had not healed properly, if the hawk could not fly, she would either have to keep the bird in permanent captivity or make the difficult decision to end her suffering. Preston seemed to sense her anxiety. He stood close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, a steady presence. "Whatever happens, you gave her a chance she would not have had otherwise," he said quietly. "That matters regardless of outcome." Katherine opened the cage door and stepped back. For a long moment the hawk did nothing, eyeing the opening with suspicion. Then, with a suddenness that made Katherine's breath catch, she hopped to the cage entrance and paused there, testing her healed wing with small movements. The hawk spread both wings fully, the repaired one extending just as far as its mate, no hesitation or weakness visible. Katherine felt tears prick her eyes as the bird crouched slightly, gathering herself, and then launched into the air with a powerful downstroke. The hawk flew in a wide circle, gaining altitude with each beat of her wings. She was strong, confident, fully healed. Katherine watched with a mixture of joy and bittersweet sadness as the bird climbed higher, becoming smaller against the blue expanse of sky. At the apex of her climb, the hawk gave a piercing cry, a sound of pure freedom and defiance, before wheeling away to the south, disappearing over the horizon. Katherine realized she was crying, tears streaming down her face, but they were good tears, the kind that came with witnessing something beautiful and right. She felt Preston's arm come around her shoulders, pulling her against his side, and she leaned into him without thinking, seeking comfort and celebration both. "You did it," Preston said, his voice thick with emotion. "You brought her back to life." "We did it," Katherine corrected, turning to look up at him. "This whole time, you have been helping her heal while you were healing yourself." Preston's expression shifted, becoming serious and tender at once. "Katherine, I need to tell you something. When I came here 2 weeks ago, I was barely holding myself together. I was drowning in grief and could not see any way forward. But working with you, talking with you, being in your presence, it has given me something I thought I had lost forever. Hope. Purpose. The ability to imagine a future that does not feel empty." His hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away her tears with a gentleness that made her heart ache. "I am falling in love with you," he said simply. "Maybe that is wrong, maybe it is too soon, maybe I should give it more time to be sure. But I have learned that time is not guaranteed, that waiting for the perfect moment means you might miss the real one. I love you, Katherine Ellis, and I needed you to know." Katherine had been waiting for these words without fully acknowledging she was waiting. Now that they were here, spoken in Preston's rough voice with complete sincerity, she felt something inside her settle and soar at the same time. "I love you too," she said, the words coming easily because they were true. "I think I started loving you when you had the courage to admit you needed help, when you showed up day after day even when it was hard, when you proved you were willing to do the work of healing." Preston kissed her then, a soft press of lips that held question and answer both. Katherine kissed him back, her hands coming up to rest against his chest where she could feel the steady beat of his heart, no longer broken but healing, growing stronger every day. They stood there in the prairie grass with the wind moving around them, holding each other as the sun sank lower, painting the sky in those impossible western colors that never looked quite real but were. Katherine thought about the hawk, flying free somewhere under that same sky, and felt a deep gratitude for the strange and winding path that had brought her to this moment. Over the following weeks, their relationship deepened and solidified. Preston continued working at Three Rivers Ranch, but he spent all his free time at the Ellis homestead, helping with the endless work that came with managing 200 acres. He mended fences and repaired the sagging barn door, and helped Katherine's mother replant the vegetable garden for winter crops. Evangeline watched their growing attachment with approval, seeing how Preston treated her daughter with respect and genuine affection. Winter came early that year, bringing snow before Thanksgiving and temperatures that dropped below zero at night. Preston and Katherine spent long evenings in the warm kitchen, talking while Evangeline knitted or prepared medicines from her dried herbs. They made plans, careful and tentative at first, then with increasing confidence. Preston spoke with the foreman at Three Rivers about his future prospects. The ranch was expanding, buying up land from smaller homesteaders who could not make it through the hard times. The foreman, pleased with Preston's renewed dedication and competence, offered him a position as assistant foreman with an increase in wages and the promise of a small house on ranch property. It was enough to build a life on, enough to support a wife. On Christmas Eve, with snow falling softly outside and the fire crackling in the hearth, Preston asked Katherine to marry him. He did it simply, without elaborate speeches, kneeling beside her chair and offering her a plain gold band that had belonged to his grandmother. "I know I come with history," he said, "with grief that will probably resurface sometimes, with memories of someone I loved before you. But I also come with a heart that has learned how to heal, how to hope again, how to love not despite the pain, but because of what the pain has taught me. "Will you marry me, Katherine?" Katherine said yes without hesitation, sliding the ring onto her finger where it fit as if made for her. They married in early March, a simple ceremony in the small church in Independence with Katherine's mother and a handful of friends from neighboring homesteads as witnesses. Katherine wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her taller frame, and carried a bouquet of early wildflowers that Preston had ridden for hours to find. They moved into the small house on Three Rivers Ranch property, a two-room cabin with a wood stove and real glass windows. It was not much, but it was theirs, the first space they had claimed together. Katherine brought her collection of medical supplies and animal care equipment, turning the second room into a workspace where she could continue the healing work that gave her life meaning. Word spread through the surrounding community about her skill with injured animals. People started bringing her wounded creatures, dogs injured in fights with coyotes, horses with infected cuts, even a young pronghorn antelope that had been caught in barbed wire. Katherine treated them all with the same patient care she had given the hawk, and Preston helped her, learning through observation and practice until he could handle many of the simpler cases himself. Their first year of marriage was not without challenges. There were hard days when Preston's grief resurfaced unexpectedly, triggered by a song or a scent or the particular quality of light at sunset. Katherine learned to recognize the signs, to give him space when he needed it, while also providing steady reassurance that his past did not threaten their present. She never tried to compete with Sarah's memory, but instead made room for it, understanding that loving someone meant accepting all of who they were, including the ghosts they carried. Katherine had her own difficult moments, days when she felt overwhelmed by the responsibility of marriage and managing a household while continuing her healing work. Preston learned to read her moods as well, to know when she needed help and when she needed to talk through her frustrations. They built a partnership based on communication and mutual support, each working to understand the other's needs and meet them where possible. Spring brought new life to the prairie, and with it, news that Katherine was pregnant. She told Preston one evening in late May as they sat on the porch of their little house watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. He was quiet for a long moment, and Katherine felt a flutter of anxiety, wondering if he was ready for this next step. Then Preston's face broke into the widest smile she had ever seen from him, joy transforming his features until he looked years younger. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close, and she felt him trembling with emotion. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Katherine asked, needing to hear him say it. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Preston replied. Terrified, excited, grateful, overwhelmed, all of it at once, but mostly just incredibly, impossibly happy. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, Katherine's naturally strong constitution serving her well through the various discomforts. She continued her work with injured animals well into her 7th month, finally stopping only when bending over became too difficult. Preston was attentive without being overbearing, making sure she had everything she needed while respecting her independence and capability. Evangeline visited regularly, checking on her daughter's health and preparing for her role as grandmother. She brought baby clothes she had sewn, soft blankets, and the kind of practical advice that only came from experience. The small house filled gradually with the items they would need: a cradle that Preston built with his own hands, cloth diapers, tiny gowns that seemed impossibly small. Their son was born on a cold February night in 1883, coming into the world with a healthy cry that announced his presence to anyone within hearing distance. Preston was there throughout the labor, holding Catherine's hand and offering what comfort he could, while Evangeline managed the medical aspects. When the baby was finally placed in Catherine's arms, red-faced and furious at being evicted from his warm home, she felt a love so fierce and immediate it took her breath away. They named him James, after Preston's father, with the middle name of Samuel for Catherine's father. He had Preston's dark hair and Catherine's green eyes, a perfect blending of both their features. Preston held his son with careful reverence, his expression full of wonder and no small amount of fear at the responsibility represented by this tiny life. "I will do better for him than my grief allowed me to do for myself," Preston said quietly, looking down at James sleeping in his arms. "I will teach him that strength comes not from avoiding pain but from learning to heal from it. That love is worth the risk of loss. That showing up day after day is how you build a life worth living." Katherine felt tears slide down her cheeks, moved by the transformation she witnessed in the man she had married. The broken cowboy who had ridden to her homestead 2 years ago, desperate for help he could not name, had become this capable father, this loving husband, this whole person who still carried scars but no longer let them define him. The years unfolded with the particular rhythm of ranch life, marked by seasons and cattle drives and the endless work of maintaining both land and family. James grew into a sturdy toddler, then a curious boy who followed his father everywhere, learning to ride almost before he could walk properly. Katherine continued her healing work, her reputation spreading until people came from 50 miles away seeking her help with injured or sick animals. 3 years after James was born, they had a daughter they named Rose, who came into the world quietly, with dark, solemn eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. She was temperamentally different from her energetic brother, more reserved and thoughtful, preferring to watch and listen before acting. Katherine saw herself in Rose, while Preston's energy lived on in James. The small house on ranch property became too cramped for their growing family. With money saved and a loan from the ranch, they built a larger home on a piece of land the owner of 3 Rivers sold them at a generous price, recognizing Preston's value and wanting to ensure his continued presence. The new house had 4 rooms, a real luxury, with a separate space for Catherine's animal healing work and a room for the children to share. Preston had risen to full foreman by this time, respected by the ranch hands and trusted by the owner. He handled the position with fairness and competence, earning loyalty through respect rather than fear. On Sundays, their one day of relative rest, the family would ride out together across the prairie, showing the children the land they called home. Katherine often thought about the hawk during those rides, wondering if the bird still flew somewhere over this same landscape. She had nursed dozens of wounded creatures back to health in the years since, but that first hawk held special significance, representing not just an injured animal saved but the beginning of her life with Preston, the moment when both their paths had changed direction. One late summer evening, when James was 7 and Rose was 4, they were sitting on the porch of their house watching the children play in the yard. James was teaching Rose how to throw a rope, demonstrating with the patient big brother energy that made Catherine's heart swell. The sun was setting in its usual spectacular fashion, the sky streaked with pink and gold. A bird's cry echoed across the prairie, high and piercing. Katherine looked up to see a red-tailed hawk circling overhead, riding the thermal currents with effortless grace. She could not know if it was the same hawk she had healed years ago, could not prove any connection. But she chose to believe it was, circling back to the place where she had learned to fly again, offering a moment of acknowledgement to the woman who had refused to let her die. Preston followed her gaze, then reached over to take her hand. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Taking on a broken cowboy along with that wounded hawk?" Katherine turned to look at him, at this man who had become her partner in every sense of the word. His face held the lines of years lived fully, joy and sorrow both written in the creases around his eyes and mouth. But there was no shadow of that haunting grief that had marked him when they first met. He had healed, not by forgetting or replacing what he had lost, but by learning to carry it as part of his story rather than the end of it. "Not for a single moment," Katherine said. "You taught me that healing is never a one-way process. I helped you find your way back to wholeness, but you did the same for me. You showed me what it meant to build a life with someone, to love deeply despite knowing that love always carries the risk of loss. You gave me our children this home, a partnership that makes every day richer. How could I possibly regret any of that?" Preston lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles with the same tenderness he had shown that first day in the barn when he had asked her to help him heal his heart. "I came to you believing I was broken beyond repair," he said. "But you saw something worth saving. You showed up every day and taught me, through patience and stubborn determination, that healing was possible. You gave me back my life, Katherine. Everything good I have now exists because you refused to give up on me." The hawk cried out again, then wheeled away toward the darkening east, disappearing against the first stars emerging in the twilight sky. Katherine watched it go, then turned her attention back to her family, to Preston sitting beside her and their children playing in the yard, to the home they had built through love and work, and the daily choice to show up for each other. More children came in the following years, twin boys when James was 9, arriving with such enthusiasm and volume that the midwife joked they were announcing their intentions to keep everyone awake for years to come. She was not wrong. Michael and Thomas were identical in appearance but opposite in temperament, one cautious and thoughtful, the other bold and constantly investigating new ways to get into trouble. Rose, delighted to no longer be the baby of the family, took her role as big sister seriously, helping Katherine manage the chaos that came with infant twins. The house expanded again, Preston and James working together to add another room and a larger kitchen. At 12, James was nearly as tall as his father, with the same lean build and capable hands. He was being groomed to eventually take over Preston's position at 3 Rivers, learning the business of running a large ranch operation. But he also had his mother's gift with animals, showing a particular talent for working with difficult horses, approaching them with patience and respect rather than force. Rose, at 9, had become Katherine's shadow in the healing work. She had inherited the gift more strongly than any of the other children, possessing an almost intuitive understanding of what wounded creatures needed. She could read subtle signs of distress or improvement that even Katherine sometimes missed, and injured animals calmed under her touch in a way that bordered on magical. Katherine watched her daughter work with a clarity that came from recognition. Rose would continue this legacy of healing, perhaps expand it beyond what Katherine had accomplished. It brought a deep satisfaction to see her skills and passion passed to the next generation. The twins, at age 6, were still too young to show their particular talents clearly, but they brought joy and energy to every aspect of family life. Michael, the quieter of the two, showed an interest in the mechanical aspects of ranch work, fascinated by how things were built and functioned. Thomas, the bold explorer, seemed destined for adventure, constantly pushing boundaries and investigating every corner of their world. Preston, at 35, had settled fully into his life in a way that would have seemed impossible during those dark days after Sarah's death. He still thought of her sometimes, particularly on dates that had once held significance. But the memories no longer carried the crushing weight of grief. She had become part of his past, honored and remembered, but no longer standing between him and his present. He and Katherine had built something solid and good, a partnership that had weathered challenges and grown stronger through them. They had disagreements, of course, moments of frustration or miscommunication. But they had learned early how to talk through difficulties rather than letting resentment build, to apologize when wrong and forgive freely. One evening in late autumn, after the children were in bed and the house was finally quiet, Preston and Katherine sat by the fire talking about the future. James would be 14 the following spring, old enough to take on real responsibility. They discussed the possibility of letting him work at Three Rivers in a more official capacity, learning the business from the ground up as Preston had. "He is good with people," Preston said, poking at the fire with the iron. "Natural leader, willing to work hard, fair-minded. He will make an excellent foreman someday, maybe even own his own ranch if that is what he wants." "He is still so young," Katherine said, though she knew the reality of their world. Boys became men early in ranch country, taking on adult responsibilities as soon as they were capable. "I want him to have time to just be a child a little longer." "I know," Preston agreed. "But we also have to prepare him for the life he will have. The world is not getting easier. Railroad companies are pushing into every corner of the territory, bringing change whether we want it or not. The open range is disappearing, carved up into smaller holdings. James will need to be adaptable, educated not just in ranch work but in business and negotiations. The cowboy life I knew when I was his age is already fading." It was true, Katherine knew. The Wild West was becoming less wild every year, civilized by railroads and telegraph lines and the steady press of settlement. In some ways, it was a good thing, bringing law and order, schools and churches, medical care and commerce. But it also meant the end of a particular way of life, the freedom and danger of the open frontier giving way to something more structured and constrained. "Things change," Katherine said softly, "but family remains. Whatever the future brings, we will face it together, all of us. That is what matters." Preston came to sit beside her on the settee, pulling her close against his side in the comfortable way of long married couples. "When I rode to your mother's house that day, 12 years ago now, I could not have imagined this," he said. "A wife I love, children, a home, purpose, contentment. I was so lost in grief I could not see past the next day, but you showed me how to heal, how to build a life worth living even after loss. You gave me everything, Katherine." "We gave each other everything," Katherine corrected, tilting her head to look up at him. "You showed me what real partnership looked like, what it meant to build something together. You taught me that love is not about fixing someone else but about growing together, supporting each other through hard times and celebrating the good ones. Everything we have, we built together." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn low, thinking about their shared past and the future still unfolding before them. Outside, the wind moved across the prairie with the particular sound of autumn, carrying the promise of winter and the distant memory of spring to come. The years continued their steady progression, bringing both joy and sorrow as all lives contain. Katherine's mother, Evangeline, passed away peacefully in her sleep during the winter of 1892, having lived to see all her grandchildren grow into capable young people. Her death, while sorrowful, carried none of the shock and anger of sudden loss. She had lived fully, served her community with dedication, and passed on her healing gifts to her daughter and granddaughter. It was, as these things went, a good death. James, at 19, had indeed taken a position at Three Rivers Ranch. working his way up through the ranks with the same dedication his father had shown. He had started courting the daughter of a neighboring rancher, a practical young woman named Alina who shared his work ethic and his love of the land. Preston and Katherine approved of the match, seeing in Alina the qualities that would make a good partner for their sometimes too serious son. Rose, at 16, had become an even more accomplished healer than her mother, treating not just animals but increasingly offering help with human ailments as well. People came from remarkable distances seeking her assistance, drawn by word of her skills and her gentle manner with patients. She had a suitor as well, the son of the town doctor, a young man studying medicine in Cheyenne with plans to return and set up practice. It was a good match, promising a partnership built on shared interests and complementary skills. The twins, now 13, continued their divergent paths. Michael had revealed a gift for engineering and mechanics, spending hours taking apart and rebuilding anything he could get his hands on. He talked about going east for education, learning the new technologies that were reshaping the world. Thomas, true to his adventurous nature, dreamed of joining the Wyoming Territorial Rangers, riding the rough country and maintaining order in areas still wild enough to need it. Preston and Katherine, in their early 40s, had reached a stage of life where the intense physical demands of raising young children had eased, replaced by different challenges and different satisfactions. Their bodies bore the marks of years of hard work, but they were both still strong and healthy, capable of the labor their life required. They had also accumulated enough savings to consider some changes. The owner of Three Rivers Ranch, now in his 70s and without children of his own, had approached Preston about the possibility of buying the ranch when he was ready to retire. It was an enormous opportunity, one that would require significant debt and risk, but it would also mean security for their children and grandchildren, a legacy built on years of dedication and hard work. Preston and Katherine discussed it at length, weighing the advantages against the risks. Finally, they decided to move forward, arranging financing through a bank in Cheyenne and preparing to take ownership of Three Rivers Ranch the following spring. It felt right, a natural progression of the life they had built, another step in the ongoing journey that had started when a wounded hawk fell from the sky and a broken cowboy asked for help healing his heart. The day James married Alina, in a ceremony held at the small church in Independence with half the county in attendance, Katherine stood watching her son with tears in her eyes. He looked so much like Preston had at that age, tall and lean and serious, but with a groundedness that spoke of having been raised with love and security, rather than needing to fight his way to stability. During the reception, held in the newly renovated barn at Three Rivers, Preston found Katherine standing alone for a moment, watching the celebration with a soft smile on her face. "What are you thinking?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. "I am thinking about how far we have come," Katherine replied. "About how a single choice to help a wounded creature led to all of this. Our marriage, our children, this life we have built. It is remarkable, really, how one moment of compassion can ripple outward to touch so many other lives." Preston slipped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. "You have touched more lives than you know," he said. "Every animal you have healed, every person you have helped, every kindness you have shown, it all ripples outward. But I am selfish enough to be most grateful for the ways you have touched my life, for the healing you brought me when I needed it most." They danced together as the evening wore on, moving to the music provided by a fiddle player from town. Katherine rested her head against Preston's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart that she had helped make whole all those years ago. Around them, their children and friends celebrated, the sound of laughter and music filling the night air. As they turned slowly across the rough wooden floor of the barn, Katherine caught sight of movement through the open door. A hawk, just visible against the darkening sky, soaring past on some evening hunt. She smiled, choosing to see it as a blessing, a reminder of where everything had started. "I love you," she whispered against Preston's chest. "Then, now, and always." "Always," Preston echoed, and in that simple word was contained the promise they had made to each other years ago, renewed every day through the small and large acts that built a marriage, a family, a life. Rose married the doctor's son, Paul, 2 years after James's wedding. The ceremony was smaller, more intimate, reflecting Rose's quieter nature. She wore Catherine's wedding dress, the same one Katherine had worn and that Evangeline had worn before her, a tangible link connecting 3 generations of women who had dedicated their lives to healing. Paul and Rose set up a combined practice in Independence, he treating human patients while she specialized in veterinary care. It was still unusual for a woman to work in such a capacity, but Rose's established reputation and her husband's support allowed her to continue the work she loved. Their practice thrived, serving a wide area and bringing modern medical care to a region that had long made do with folk remedies and hope. The twins, at 18, went their separate ways as everyone had expected. Michael secured a scholarship to a technical college in Chicago, heading east with plans to learn engineering and bring new innovations back to Wyoming. Thomas joined the Territorial Rangers, riding out to keep peace in the rough corners of the territory that still resisted the steady march of civilization. Both paths worried Katherine in different ways, but she had learned that children had to find their own roads, make their own mistakes and victories. Preston officially took ownership of 3 Rivers Ranch in the spring of 1895, a transfer that felt more like inheritance than purchase given the relationship he had built with the previous owner over 20 years of dedicated service. The ranch covered 15,000 acres of prime grazing land, running several hundred head of cattle and providing employment for 20 ranch hands and their families. It was a significant responsibility, one that required constant attention and hard work. But Preston had been preparing for it his entire adult life, and with James working as his assistant foreman, he had both the experience and the support system to manage it successfully. Katherine took on the administrative side of the business, managing accounts and supplies with the same careful attention she brought to everything else. They renamed the ranch, calling it New Flight Ranch in honor of the hawk that had brought them together. Some of their neighbors thought it was a strange name for a cattle operation, but Preston and Katherine knew what it meant: the promise of second chances and healing and the possibility of soaring again after being broken. The new sign at the ranch entrance featured a hawk in flight, wings spread wide, climbing toward the sun. The new century arrived with celebration, and no small amount of trepidation about what the future might hold. The Wild West of Preston and Katherine's youth had transformed into something more settled, more civilized, better in many ways but lacking some of the raw freedom of earlier times. Automobiles were starting to appear on the streets of Cheyenne, strange, noisy machines that spooked the horses and promised to change transportation forever. Telephones connected distant towns, allowing conversations across hundreds of miles. Preston and Katherine, now in their late 40s, watched these changes with interest tempered by the awareness that they belonged more to the old world than the new. But their children would bridge that gap, carrying forward the values of hard work, integrity, and compassion while adapting to new technologies and new ways of living. James and Alina had 3 children by 1902, giving Preston and Katherine grandchildren who brought new energy and joy to the ranch. The oldest, a serious little girl named Katherine after her grandmother, showed early signs of inheriting the family gift with animals. She followed Katherine everywhere when visiting, asking endless questions about healing and handling injured creatures with a gentleness remarkable in a 5-year-old. Rose and Paul had 2 children, both boys who seemed destined to follow their parents into medicine. Even as young children, they played at bandaging each other's imaginary wounds and making potions from water and leaves. Rose taught them about animal care while Paul introduced them to human anatomy, giving them an education that spanned both worlds. Michael, working in Chicago, wrote frequent letters describing the wonders of the modern city, the electric lights and elevated trains, the tall buildings rising toward the sky. He had married a schoolteacher from Illinois, a woman none of the family had met yet, but who sounded lovely in Michael's descriptions. They planned to visit Wyoming the following summer, and Katherine looked forward to finally meeting her new daughter-in-law. Thomas, still riding with the Rangers, remained unmarried and seemingly content with his rootless life. His letters came less frequently, but were always entertaining, full of adventures and close calls, and the kind of excitement that made Katherine grateful he was too far away for her to worry about constantly. He had inherited his father's old wandering spirit, that need to keep moving that Preston had only settled once he found Katherine. One early summer evening in 1903, Preston and Katherine rode out together across ranch land, something they still did regularly despite the demands on their time. It was a beautiful night, the air warm and clear, the prairie grass moving in waves under a steady breeze. They dismounted near a high point that offered a view across miles of rolling grassland, all of it part of New Flight Ranch, the legacy they were building for their children and grandchildren. "Do you remember the first time we rode out here together?" Preston asked, standing close enough that their shoulders touched. "It was about a month after we met, when we were still figuring out what we meant to each other." Katherine smiled at the memory. "You were so nervous, trying to be respectful while also making it clear you were interested in more than just healing lessons. I thought it was charming, how you managed to be both confident and uncertain at the same time." "I was terrified," Preston admitted. "Terrified of loving again after losing Sarah. Terrified of somehow dishonoring her memory. Terrified that I would lose you too and would not survive it a second time. But you taught me that love is always a risk worth taking, that hiding from the possibility of loss means missing out on the possibility of joy." He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "We have been married 20 years now, Katherine. 20 years of building a life together, of raising children and running a ranch and healing whatever wounded creatures cross our path. It has been hard sometimes. Nothing about this life is easy, but I would not change a single moment of it. You saved me in every way a person can be saved, and I spend every day grateful for the chance to love you." Katherine felt tears gathering, the good kind that came with deep emotion rather than sorrow. "You saved me too, you know. Before you, I was so focused on healing others that I had not thought much about building a life of my own. You showed me what partnership could be, what it meant to share a life fully with someone else. Everything good I have comes from loving you and being loved by you in return." They kissed as the sun set behind them, a soft, lingering connection that held 2 decades of shared history and the promise of whatever years remained ahead. Around them, the prairie stretched away in all directions, their land, their legacy, the physical manifestation of what could be built through love and work and the daily choice to show up for each other. A hawk cried overhead, and they both looked up to see it circling against the darkening sky. Katherine thought, not for the first time, about that original wounded hawk, about the moment when she had chosen to help rather than walk away. That single act of compassion had changed everything, had brought Preston into her life and started them down this path that had led to marriage and children and grandchildren, to this ranch and this moment. "Thank you," Preston said softly, though Katherine was not entirely sure what he was thanking her for. Everything, probably. The healing, the love, the life they had built. All of it. "Thank you," Katherine echoed, meaning the same thing. They stood together on that high point, as stars began emerging in the vast Wyoming sky. Two people who had found each other through shared brokenness and built something whole and lasting from the pieces. The hawk circled once more, then wheeled away into the gathering darkness, flying free and strong, a living reminder that healing was always possible for those brave enough to try. The years that followed continued their steady progression, bringing the expected mixture of joy and sorrow, triumph and challenge. Thomas finally married, surprising everyone by choosing as his bride a Cheyenne woman named Bright Morning who worked as a translator for the territorial government. The marriage required them both to navigate complex cultural tensions and prejudice from both communities, but they faced it with dignity and determination. Katherine and Preston welcomed Bright Morning into their family without reservation, seeing in her the same strength and grace they valued in all their children's partners. Michael and his wife Margaret came west to visit, bringing with them tales of city life and the rapid technological advances reshaping the world. Michael had become a successful engineer, working on projects that ranged from bridge construction to early electrical systems. But after 2 weeks on the ranch, helping with the summer work and reconnecting with the land of his childhood, he confided to his parents that he missed Wyoming and was considering relocating his family. By 1910, all the children had returned to Wyoming in one form or another, drawn back by family ties and the pull of the land that had shaped them. James and Alina had taken over day-to-day management of New Flight Ranch, allowing Preston and Katherine to ease gradually into something resembling retirement, though neither of them could fully stop working. Preston, at 54, still rose before dawn and rode out to check on cattle, though he limited himself to shorter days and let the younger men handle the most physically demanding tasks. His hair had gone mostly gray, and his face bore the deep lines of decades spent outdoors, but he remained strong and active, not ready to surrender to age just yet. Katherine, at 52, continued her healing work, though she had officially passed most of it to Rose. She still treated the difficult cases, the injured animals that required her specific expertise, but she was content to let her daughter handle the routine work. Her hands had developed arthritis, a painful reminder that bodies wore out no matter how carefully you treated them. But she worked through the discomfort with the same stubborn determination that had characterized her entire life. They had 11 grandchildren now, ranging from newborns to teenagers, a boisterous clan that filled the house during holidays and made the ranch feel vibrant and alive. Preston and Katherine took joy in watching the next generation grow, seeing which children inherited the family's various gifts and interests. Katherine, James's oldest daughter and now a confident 14-year-old, had become Katherine's constant companion, learning everything she could about healing animals. She had her grandmother's gift magnified, an almost supernatural ability to calm frightened creatures and diagnose problems that were not immediately obvious. Katherine watched her granddaughter work with the same satisfaction she had felt watching Rose develop her skills, knowing the legacy would continue. One of Rose's sons, Samuel, showed remarkable aptitude for human medicine, already talking about medical school despite being only 12. His younger brother Jonathan was more interested in the business side of things, showing an early talent for numbers and organization that suggested he might eventually help manage the family's various enterprises. Thomas and Bright Morning's children, two daughters who carried both their mother's Cheyenne heritage and their father's ranching background, were being raised to honor both cultures. It required careful navigation and constant vigilance against prejudice, but the girls were growing up strong and proud, comfortable in both worlds. Katherine thought often about how much the world had changed in her lifetime, how much further it still needed to go. Michael and Margaret's son, named Preston after his grandfather, was a mechanical prodigy at 10 years old, taking apart and successfully rebuilding anything he could get his hands on. Young Preston talked constantly about airplanes, those impossible machines that had recently succeeded in achieving powered flight, dreaming of the day when he might build or fly one himself. Preston Sr. watched his grandson's enthusiasm with amused tolerance, marveling at how different the world had become. When he was young, the height of technology had been the railroad, those steam-powered engines that connected distant cities. Now, people were flying, talking across vast distances through telephone wires, even capturing moving images on film. It was remarkable and slightly overwhelming, this new century rushing forward with such velocity. But some things remained constant. The land still required hard work and careful stewardship. Cattle still needed tending, fences still needed mending, and the seasons still cycled through their eternal progression. Love still mattered, family still provided the foundation for everything else, and showing up day after day still built the kind of life worth living. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Preston surprised Katherine by organizing a celebration that brought together friends and family from across Wyoming and beyond. Over 100 people gathered at New Flight Ranch for a party that lasted from afternoon well into the night, featuring food, music, dancing, and countless toasts to the couple who had built such a remarkable legacy. Late in the evening, after most of the guests had departed and only family remained, James stood to offer a final toast. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass, "who taught us through example what real love looks like. Not the easy romance of storybooks, but the hard daily work of building a life together. They showed us that healing is possible, that broken things can be made whole, that showing up with patience and determination can transform everything. They built this ranch, this family, this legacy of compassion and hard work. Everything we are comes from everything they are. To Preston and Katherine Aldridge, the foundation on which all of us stand." Everyone raised their glasses, echoing the toast, and Katherine felt overwhelmed by gratitude and love. She looked around at her children and grandchildren, at the friends who had become like family over the years, at the ranch that represented the physical manifestation of everything she and Preston had built together. It was more than she had ever imagined possible during those early days when she was just a young woman nursing a wounded hawk back to flight. Preston squeezed her hand, and when she turned to look at him, she saw her own emotions reflected in his face. Joy, gratitude, love, and the particular satisfaction that came from a life well lived, from work that mattered and relationships that endured. "We did good, didn't we?" he said softly for her ears alone. "We did," Katherine agreed. "We did very good." The next decade brought its share of challenges as the world continued its rapid transformation. The Great War erupted in Europe, and though America initially remained neutral, The conflict sent ripples across the ocean that affected even their remote corner of Wyoming. When America finally entered the war in 1917, young men from across the state enlisted or were drafted, including two of their grandsons who were old enough to serve. Those were anxious years, waiting for letters from the front, dreading the arrival of telegrams that might bring devastating news. Katherine thought often about Preston's description of waiting helplessly while Sarah died, the particular torture of loving someone whose fate was beyond your control. Both their grandsons survived and returned home, changed by what they had witnessed but alive, and the family's collective relief was profound. The war's end in 1918 brought hope for peace, though the influenza pandemic that followed killed more people than the conflict itself. The Ellis and Aldridge families were largely spared, though several people in the surrounding community succumbed. Katherine and Rose worked tirelessly treating the sick, using every skill they possessed to fight the invisible enemy. The pandemic eventually passed, leaving grief and trauma in its wake, but also a renewed appreciation for the precious fragility of life. Preston and Katherine entered their 60s, having witnessed remarkable changes. Women could vote now, a development Katherine had advocated for her entire adult life. Automobiles had replaced horses for most transportation, though Preston still preferred riding when possible. Radio brought news and entertainment from distant cities directly into homes. The country was moving into what people called the modern age, and while much had been gained, something had also been lost of the simpler, if harder, life they had known in their youth. New Flight Ranch continued to thrive under James's management, adapting to new technologies and new methods while maintaining the core values Preston and Katherine had established. The ranch employed modern equipment where practical, had installed telephone lines and electricity, but still operated on the fundamental principle that good stewardship of land and animals produced the most sustainable success. In the summer of 1925, the family gathered at the ranch to celebrate Preston and Katherine's 43rd wedding anniversary. It was a smaller affair than their 25th had been, limited to immediate family, but no less meaningful. Preston was now 69, Katherine 67, their hair completely white, their faces deeply lined, their bodies showing the wear of decades of hard physical work. But they were still together, still in love, still partners in every meaningful sense. Preston still reached for Katherine's hand when they walked together. Katherine still felt her heart lift when she saw him riding in from checking on cattle. They still talked for hours about everything and nothing, that easy communication of people who had spent a lifetime learning each other's thoughts and rhythms. Their children were all successful in their own ways, raising families, contributing to their communities, living good lives built on the foundation Preston and Katherine had provided. Their grandchildren were growing up, starting careers, getting married, having children of their own. The family tree had grown extensive, branches spreading outward from the original trunk, all of it rooted in that choice Katherine had made 45 years ago to nurse a wounded hawk back to flight. During the anniversary dinner, Preston stood to speak, something he rarely did given his preference for action over words. The room fell quiet as everyone turned attention to him. "I am not much for speeches," he began, his voice rough with age but still strong. "But I wanted to say something while I have the chance, while we are all gathered together. 43 years ago, I rode to Katherine's mother's house as desperate and broken as any man has ever been. I had lost the woman I planned to marry, and in losing her, I had lost myself. I could not see any path forward, could not imagine a future that did not feel empty and pointless." He paused, looking at Katherine with such love and tenderness that everyone in the room felt it. Then, I met this remarkable woman who showed me that healing was possible. Not easy, not quick, but possible if you were willing to do the work. She nursed a wounded hawk back to flight, and when I asked, she agreed to help heal my broken heart too. Everything good in my life, everything you see around you, exists because Katherine Ellis took a chance on a broken cowboy. Preston's voice thickened with emotion, but he pushed through. She gave me love, partnership, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, purpose, this ranch, this legacy. But more than any of that, she gave me back myself. She taught me that life after loss was possible, that joy could return after grief, that showing up day after day with patience and determination could transform everything. I have spent 43 years trying to be worthy of the gift she gave me, and I will spend however many years remain continuing that effort. Katherine, you are the best thing that ever happened to me, and I love you more today than I did the day we married, which I would not have believed possible but has proven absolutely true. There was not a dry eye in the room by the time Preston finished. Katherine stood and went to him, and they embraced while their family applauded, celebrating not just an anniversary but the remarkable love story they had all witnessed unfold across more than 4 decades. Preston passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 years later, in the winter of 1928. He had spent the previous day riding across ranch land with James, checking on cattle, discussing plans for spring. He came home for dinner, spent the evening reading by the fire with Katherine sitting beside him doing needlework, went to bed at his usual time, and simply did not wake up. As deaths went, it was as gentle as anyone could hope for, a quiet ending after a life fully lived. Katherine grieved deeply, as anyone would after losing a partner of 46 years. But it was a different kind of grief than Preston had carried after Sarah's death. Not the crushing, paralyzing variety, but something gentler. Sadness mixed with gratitude for all the years they had shared. She missed him terribly, felt his absence like a physical ache, but she did not question the life they had built or regret the pain that came with loss. She lived another 7 years, dying at age 74 surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who had all benefited from the love and healing she had brought into the world. Her last words, spoken to Rose who sat beside her bed, were about the hawk. "I think about her sometimes," Katherine whispered, her voice weak but clear. "That first hawk, the one that started everything. I hope she had a good life, hope she flew free and strong for many years. She gave me so much without knowing it, gave me Preston and everything that came after." Sometimes the smallest acts of compassion ripple outward in ways we cannot predict, touching lives we will never know about. That is what I tried to do. Take that gift the hawk gave me and pass it forward through healing, through love, through simply showing up when others needed help. I hope it mattered. I hope it made a difference. "It did, Mama," Rose assured her, tears streaming down her face. "You touched more lives than you could possibly count, made more difference than you could measure. Everything we are, everything this family has become, it all comes from you and the choices you made. Rest now. You have earned it." Katherine smiled, closed her eyes, and slipped peacefully away, joining Preston wherever it is that souls go after the body releases them. The family buried Katherine next to Preston on a high point at New Flight Ranch, the same place they had stood together so many times watching the sun set over land they loved. The gravestone bore both their names and dates, with a simple inscription below. They healed each other, and in healing, built something eternal. New Flight Ranch continued under family management for decades more, eventually growing to 25,000 acres and becoming one of the most successful operations in Wyoming. The healing tradition Katherine started continued through Rose and Rose's children and grandchildren, an unbroken line of people dedicated to easing suffering wherever they found it. The family grew and branched, spreading across Wyoming and beyond, carrying forward the values Preston and Katherine had instilled. They told stories about their remarkable ancestors who had met through a wounded hawk, who had fallen in love while learning to heal together, who had built an enduring legacy out of compassion and determination, and the daily choice to show up for each other. And sometimes, on clear Wyoming evenings when the light was just right, family members would swear they saw a hawk circling high above the ranch, riding thermal currents with effortless grace. It was impossible, of course, that it could be the same bird from so many years ago. Hawks did not live that long, and even if they did, that particular hawk would have been gone nearly a century. But the family members who believed in such things, who understood that some stories transcended simple facts, chose to see it as the original hawk, still flying, still free, still watching over the ranch that existed because Katherine had refused to let her die. A reminder that healing, once begun, rippled outward forever, touching lives across generations, building legacies that endured long after the original healer had gone. The hawk cried out, a piercing sound of joy and freedom, then wheeled away toward the darkening horizon, wings spread wide, climbing toward stars just beginning to emerge in the vast eternal sky. Flying, always flying, healed and whole and gloriously alive, just as Katherine had promised all those years ago when she first chose compassion over convenience, connection over safety, and in making that choice, changed everything that came after.